Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
Okay, before we get started today, I wanted to acknowledge Dave Glenn, who has been helping us very generously with advertising and social media. And Dave, we hope you're listening, and thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Dave.
Thank you very much, Dave.
So I had suggested the topic of heartbreak. Because it is certainly something that people come into treatment with. And it can be so very, very painful and really kind of life-changing. I mean, I think most of us probably have had a heartbreak. And if we think about who we were before the heartbreak and who we were after, it can really set us on a course and sort of temper us. And kind of burn away superfluities.
No, but I get what you're reaching for. The idea that in the popular culture, I think there can be a feeling that heartbreak is terrible. It's this, misfortune. I wish we could avoid it. But from a depth perspective, heartache is a dimension of human experience. And yes, it's painful. But yes, it can unlock potential in the soul and can edit the personality, can move us out of being naive.
When I think about heartbreak, about sort of what it is and really what's going on in the person, I think about attachment. And, there's attachment is a whole area of research and theory. And it, what it tells us is that we're all wired to be attached to each other and that this is something that we need to survive, which of course is true. And we're always looking for attachment, and we're looking for that attachment to be reciprocated. And we attach to our primary caregivers, obviously. And throughout our lives, we're looking to have attachment, to have secure attachment. And one of the things that happens with heartbreak, whether that comes because our partner, rejected us, or perhaps because a loved one died, because that's an experience of heartbreak too. What happens is it's like that invisible cord that connects us to the other person when we're attached has been brutally severed.
Yes.
That's the image I have. And I have this story about this, okay? That to me is very poignant, although it's also a little funny. So for a time, I had backyard ducks. And their names were Hazel and Rose. And, ducks, like other fowl, are they're flock animals. I mean, I think a lot of birds are, which means they're really strongly attached to their flock mates. And in fact, some of the early work around attachment was done by Conrad Lorenz with geese. There's some really charming YouTube videos where you see Conrad Lorenz with these geese following him around because he was their attachment figure. In any case, one terrible day, we heard a ruckus in the backyard, and I looked out, and there was a raccoon who was on Rose, and I ran out and I tried to do what I could to save Rose, but it was too far gone. But there was Hazel, and she had come up toward the house, and she walked right up to me, which she didn't usually do. And I just picked her right up, and I, protected her from the raccoon, but Rose was gone. Okay. So now we just had Hazel. Well, Hazel, who had always been a very sweet, sociable, pleasant personality duck, became really distraught. She was physically safe. Everything was fine. She had everything she needed. But she would just stand in the backyard and quack unconsolably in distress. And when I went outside, she would just sort of light up and just follow me around, and would be very upset when I went inside. And my my neighbor told me that Hazel would just be completely distraught in the backyard, and then when Hazel heard my car drive up, she would become activated. She like knew I was home, and it was a lot of pressure. I was, I was like, I really loved Hazel, but I was like, Hazel, I can't be your attachment figure. I just that's just that's too much. So we did get Hazel some more ducks, and that worked out okay. She was happier after that. But that image of her just completely inconsolable because she had lost her flockmate. I think that's how we feel when we're heartbroken.
So there's love, and then there is, its opposite, which is so heartbreaking, which is loss. And that kind of heartbreak is more than feeling sad.
Yes.
It's that a part of you has been ripped out and it's gone, and there's an emptiness. You're not whole anymore. Ugh. And it feels like you never will be. I'll never get past this. I'll never recover, because it goes way below ego feeling sad to a part of me has been eviscerated.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it is more than just on a feeling level. I'm thinking just tangentially about this syndrome called Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, which is broken heart syndrome. And much of this research originally came out of Japan, where almost exclusively in women who have these enormous losses that they can track changes to one of the ventricles of the heart. And one of the muscle walls, I believe it's on the left ventricle, will actually balloon outward just from the emotional stress of a massive heartbreak. So this goes to what you were saying, that there is something absolutely in the matrix of being alive, not even just human, but being alive, where profound losses change us.
And those molecules of emotion are all over our bodies. They're in our hearts, literally and physiologically, and they're in our guts, our stomachs. So that there is a powerful link between biology and feeling.
And to have a significant attachment cut, it's agonizing. It's agonizing.
And it's unassimilable by ego. Sadness we can kind of feel but integrate it, whereas this kind of heartbreak is traumatic, which means it goes beyond ego, and we're stunned, we're emptied, we're bereft, we are not ourselves. It's a change in our state of self, not just a feeling that we have.
And it's something that has to be lived through, that it's a psycho-spiritual landscape that has to be traversed. It can't be cleverly thought through, that we have to be changed by it and emerge. And we are different at the end of particularly a first heartbreak, perhaps every heartbreak, but really a first heartbreak really does something to us. And again, which is not universally terrible, but it does change us.
Yeah, we're really not the same after that. There's this way that a heartbreak is kind of a defeat for the ego. It's like when you're really, let's say you're in love, and your love object says, babe, I don't want to do this anymore, and it's like, there is this voice that rises up, this kind of egoic voice that says, this isn't fair. How could you do this to me? The ego wants to hang on to the thing that was good and sort of restore it and bring it back just the way it was. And I think that, Joseph, what you were talking about sort of surrendering to it and experiencing it, I think a lot of people have this, really resist that by trying to restore it through ego measures. I mean, I think that's a totally normal thing, by the way. It's just that if you resist too long or too much, then you really, psychic life kind of deadens because you're not allowing it to move through you and for transformation to happen.
So let's think about what that looks like to somehow defend against a heartbreaking loss.
Oh, one thing I can think of is I had a friend years ago who had lost their beloved and was obsessively imagining ways to get this person back into their lives, which interfere with their ability to date other people or to find anybody else interesting. That it was all about, how could this happen to me and what could I do to win them back? And this went on for years, just trapped in that place. So that's one, I think, very tragic kind of outcome.
Yeah, that's really this kind of ego hanging on to it, kind of not moving through grief, right?
Yes, and taking it to a new place, from which you then launch and have other relationships, which are informed by the fact that you are now loving a new person with a broken heart, which is different from a young love where you are loving somebody with a whole but naive heart.
And perhaps an idealized heart, and a heart that projects certain qualities onto the other, which it's normal and it's human. And we do that we often fall in love, madly in love, with someone who seems to have either our own disowned qualities or our own less developed qualities.
I would like to hear more about that. I don't generally think of it that way, but I'm very interested in this idea of love being driven by recognizing or seeing somebody as embodying our undeveloped qualities.
So let's say one person in the couple is introverted and not very at ease in social situations. Just to name one aspect of this hypothetical relationship. The other person is confident, extroverted, loves socializing, and people love that person and respond very, very well. So this person, the one who is more timid, in a way has outsourced his or her extroverted social confidence onto the other person, and by becoming a couple, now has access to it. But if the relationship suffers a breakup, and that's what we call it, heartbreak, breaking up, then what has happened is that the person no longer has access in this vicarious or projected way to extroverted social confidence, and is right back where he or she started. How to make friends, how to go out, how to make conversation at a party. And it's been that task of developing that part has been avoided because for a while it was located in another person. Whereas the true task is, how do I do that in and for myself? And over time, let's imagine this relationship went on for 40 or 50 years. Hopefully then we do locate it in ourselves. We see how our partner does it. We're exposed to it. We kind of absorb it and pick it up naturally. But one way or the other, it is our task not to project disowned or underdeveloped parts of ourselves onto another person.
And yet the projective phenomena is natural, and it is a way of the psyche ringing a bell and forcing us to encounter something that perhaps we have refused to develop or refused to attend to in any other way. So then projection is kind of the last ditch effort of our souls to force us to interact with it. But I'm thinking about this anima animus dynamic that you're unpacking, and the way in which we don't necessarily fall in love with somebody who has any quality that we haven't developed, but has very specific qualities that we haven't developed, that the soul has kind of prioritized as something that's really pivotal, really needed. So in every woman, there is an image of an idealized partner that is the embodiment of all of her potential that the soul is deeply interested in. In every man, there is an image of a partner who embodies all of the qualities they haven't developed, which are partially socially determined, but partially very, very unique. And so that idea that our mates, our beloved, compensate for us in the naive heart. So when I think about the naive heart, I think about the heroic heart. I think, to be very blunt about it, I think there is a certain kind of arrogance in our first loves, this certain kind of certainty in the value of our love. And I can remember the first time I had a magnificent passion, telling my parents with kind of outrage, why can't I go over, to this person's house and be with them? And you're just obstructing something that's so good, so wonderful. And you're just a monster in the way of my great, magnificent love, which the whole world should be lit up by. And yet, as parents often do, slow things down because they can feel that the fire is too bright, too hot, and there's an uninformed innocence about it.
Yes. That's exactly it with first love. And again, we're human and we surrender to this. And there is a quality of innocence that when it is shattered, it is really awful. Mythologically, because we often ground things in these psychic truths and stories that have existed and been told and retold over millennia sometimes. I think of the myth of Psyche and Eros. She was a beautiful young woman and was supposed to be sort of sacrificed in marriage by marrying a monster. But instead, Eros or Cupid comes and falls in love with her because she's so beautiful and takes her off to the Crystal Palace. It has no walls. Everything is lovely. Invisible hands bring her whatever she wants to eat. Music will play whenever she wishes to hear music. Life couldn't be better. It's truly heavenly, idyllic, and she's in paradise. She is not allowed to see him. She can join him in the bedroom every night, and her jealous sisters try to plant with their envy these seeds of suspicion that maybe he really is a monster. And what do you mean you've never seen him? You better take a look. And when she does some of the wax from candles or oil from her lamp fall on him, he's burned, he flies away, and kaboom. End of Crystal Palace. It disappears. It's over. And there she is standing alone in the forest, and then has to go and appeal to her very angry, irate, and jealous mother-in-law, who is a goddess, for help, and is set to do all these various tasks. She has 4 different tasks, and she can't believe she can do any of them. And each time help comes from another source. But it's a classic image and tale written in very down-to-earth language about the shattering of that illusion, the shattering of innocence, the shattering that you can again find paradise. You can re-enter the Garden of Eden. You have a love that is special and magical and forever, and nothing could ever change it. And when it does change, it is heartbreaking.
Yeah, that was a beautiful retelling, Deb. And I was thinking while you were talking about it, the way that these naive first loves often involve a fantasy of kind of rescue or kind of this idealized kind of, we will be totally taken care of, there will be no trouble. If we don't consciously realize that that's our expectation, we really don't understand yet maybe that the reality of a long relationship involves a lot of toil and strife and is not idealized like the Crystal Palace. So that can be part of the heartbreak, is the loss of that idealized vision of what our relationship is going to be.
And in that way, the heartbreak is initiatic. I mean, the heart breaks.
Yes.
And then life inhabits the heart, which is the ordinary, is the struggles and the sacrifices and the stuff that's really tough about being partnered, and the tough part about being deeply attached to another person who isn't your idea of perfection. to have to suffer the humanity of the partner and have your humanity suffered, which cracks open the perfect little circle of the heart and makes it something different and something better, I think. When I think of the difference between the naive heart and the broken heart, I really think about mythologically the difference between Apollo and Dionysus. And Apollo was the most beautiful of the gods, the god of harmony and healing and music, and perfectly temperate, perfectly glorious, the god of the sun, and constantly yearning for love and companionship. And when Apollo would arrive to a woman and offer his love and his adoration, he was repeatedly rejected. That his idealization, his kind of heroic perfection, and in a sense, his naive and uninitiated heart was not appealing. And underneath that was this tremendous amount of aggression and revenge, which he would visit upon the women who would not receive him. But I think that's an image of the self-contained and glorious heart that shines like the sun. And the brother of Apollo was Dionysus, who was fat and sensuous and effeminate and dressed in women's clothing and was outrageous and a little wacky and crazy.
And drank a lot.
And had been killed several times and resurrected. And in the stories, he would often be killed, but a little piece of his heart would be saved, which would be spirited away. And a new form of Dionysus would grow from this piece of the heart that was left. And people loved Dionysus, that women would flock to him just magnetically, constantly wanting to be connected to his ecstasy and the joy that he evoked. And so when I think about that, Dionysus is really the god of brokenness, but not killed. That there's a way in which there's a spirit in the heart that resurrects over and over again, despite the fact that it's broken and there's enormous suffering that happens over and over again.
That's really lovely. That when we feel, when we care, when we love, our hearts will reconstitute in some way. And I'm remembering with Dionysus, his whole body was dismembered, and part of his heart or his whole heart was embedded in the thigh of Zeus. And it was not a pretty process, in other words. And yet the heart does reconstitute, that if we love, if we surrender to it, there's a promise there, a hope, something. We will be different afterwards. We will not have the same body. We will not be the same spirit, the same psyche, but we will go on.
And that there's something about dating somebody who comes to us with a broken heart, or when we are coming to, let's say, the dating situation with a broken heart, that the broken heart arrives with humility and concern about its safety and a kind of psychological information about the suffering as well as the joy that love can bring, which evokes a very different feeling in the love relationship that I think is much more psychologically informed, much more delicate, and much deeper.
Yeah, it's been tempered.
It's been tempered, but also its defenses have been broken through, at least to some degree. That when we come with a broken heart, we're really aware of the quivering inside of us.
Well, we don't have that sense of inflation.
Exactly. There's something very just humble. Humble is similar to the word humus, which is earth. That there's something much more grounded about the way we approach love after we're heartbroken. And I think if love finds us after we've been heartbroken, and let's say love chooses us, because I think there's a transcendental component to it, that we love differently. We love much more sensitively when we have suffered a heartbreak.
And we love without expecting, one hopes, the other person to somehow complete us. Or, you know what, two hearts will beat as one, and my partner will fill in my gaps, versus two more whole people who can make each other's lives bigger, richer, deeper, warmer, but two whole people who have more love to give without some of the idealization and dependency and projection. It is a different experience.
One of the things that's happening for me as I sit with this conversation is that I realize that that this thing is happening that I think happens a lot just in general in life, which is, we're talking about kind of where heartbreak can go, how it can transform us, how it can kind of set us up to be in new relationships in a different way. And the bell that's ringing in my mind at the same time, while I think this is all true, is when you feel heartbroken, you
feel
can't,
any of that, promise.
No, you can't.
You just feel horrible.
You just,
yes.
One of the things that came to me is in King Lear, oh my God, when Cordelia, right? That's her name.
Yeah.
When she dies and Lear's reaction to it, he says, howl, howl, howl. And then he says, why should a dog, a horse, a rat have life and thou no breath at all? He just can't fathom it, the reality that she has gone. It's just too big. It's just too big to feel. It just feels unbearable.
Yeah, I'm aware that we've been talking about heartbreak in an implicit kind of context of a relationship between, two younger people and a kind of dating or mating situation. But of course, there are all kinds of situations that break our hearts. Yeah. And your example of King Lear losing his daughter is one of them. And people die. There are tragedies and traumas and heartbreaking losses.
And it is that way that, say losing a beloved, it is an encounter with the self, with a capital S, that which is truly numinous in a kind of awful way. Something so much bigger than us, so inexorable, that which cannot be bargained with. We were saying before about how the ego wants to demand its way, but the ego is just this little kind of flailing fly saying, what, give me back my beloved or whatever. But, when the beloved has moved on for whatever reason, either because, he or she is left or because death has taken the person, there is nothing we can do. There's this kind of existential helplessness. All we can do is sort of submit to this
encounter that we cannot control something. Another thing I'm thinking about that many clients have brought in is the death of a pet. And particularly the death of a childhood pet, which is, for many people, is the first experience of heartbreak. It's something that they just loved so fully, so unconditionally, that the loss of the pet was inconceivable to a child. And yet children outlive pets. And at a certain point, the death of the beloved happens. And the nervous system, the soul of the child has to find their way through that terrible loss.
Well, and adults can be bereft at losing pets too.
Absolutely.
They can be significant love objects.
There is something that has always been there that is gone, and there is a vacancy. There is an absence where something once was, and in fullness and presence and a kind of taking for granted of my pet is there, my beloved is there. And it is that emptiness that I think is so difficult, poignant, and at times just there are no words. It goes beyond sorrow of something is missing that was there. And there is a vacancy and an absence. There is a huge hole in psyche.
And it, it's the cliche is, that it takes time, but it's true. that it takes time to heal those wounds. Nothing else really works. You just have to suffer it.
And I'm wondering how both of you imagine what happens in the psyche during that time, when we go from the devastation of the heartbreak to the new state.
What came up for me immediately is another myth, because it moved me when I read it, probably around age 10 in a children's book of myths, of the abduction of Persephone, who is a lovely young maiden. And the gods have kind of colluded, and she's in a field of flowers. And up from the underworld comes Hades in his chariot with his black horses and scoops her up and takes her down to the underworld. And then we don't know what happened. According to which version of the myth you read, let's say 6 months later or 8 months later or 4 months later, she is reunited with her mother, who has been bereft and heartbroken, and has morphed from being a maiden to being the queen of the underworld. And I've always wondered, what did she do down there? How did that happen? What did she do every day? Who did she talk to? What did she learn? How was that recovery possible? And in a way, I think it's a mystery. That the darkness is a mystery, and that there is also empowering and healing potential in the darkness. Now, the other side of that is her mother, Demeter, who is relentless and gives us a picture of what happens to heal. She's relentless in her quest for the recovery of her daughter.
Talk about really trying to, that sort of egoic, I'm going to get her back kind of thing.
She's going to restore the old situation at all costs.
Yes.
And it is partly restored in that Persephone can come up and be with her mother, on the earth, on the surface of the earth for part of the year, and then retreats to the underworld for part of the year.
But it's never really the same, is it?
It's never, absolutely not. Imagine that your sweet, darling teenage girl
with the slender ankles.
Has been living with Hades, Lord of the Underworld, for X number of months. And when she emerges, she is different. She's the queen of the underworld, and she has power. I like that there is that mystery. And I'm building on what you said, Lisa. I think of we keep going. Time passes. Something happens. And it's that the heart does somehow regenerate. It is different. But we do come into new life, and one hopes wiser life, wiser in the sense of a wiser heart, not a head process, but the ability to suffer and to grieve and to not know, to feel lost, that we have been able to live that. You're saying too about drinking it down to its dregs.
Yeah, to really feel it. I'm going to answer your question, Joseph. And Deb, I'm just going to pick right up on your use of myths, because one of the things that happens with Psyche and Eros, and that's such a great example. I mean, she's just completely heartbroken. She's been cast out of paradise and she's lost her beloved. And one of the tasks that she has to do, I'm a little bit fuzzy on the tasks, I have to say. But one of them, I know that it may be that she has to do that thing where she has to polish the poppy seeds or separate them from the wheat seeds, or one of those kind of typical tasks. But what happens is the ants come and help her.
Yes.
And the ants, I've always thought of the ants in that story as kind of the autonomous functioning of the unconscious that happens whether we will it or not. So it's that way when we're very, very depressed and down, say, and we just can't even get out of bed, maybe. But something in the unconscious, there's some little energy that still does the thing that needs to get done. whatever that is, that we may
Yes.
not even be aware of, but somehow it happens, So even when all of our energy is just drained away from us, the ants come. There is this little remnant of psychic life that just proceeds. The other thing I wanted to pick up on is Demeter. I've always been really fascinated by exactly what you're talking about in this story, what Demeter does when her daughter is taken away. And, she does sort of relentlessly pursue her. She asks all these questions. She finds out what happened. She gets really angry at Zeus and the other gods that were in on this, and she rails against them, and she tries to bargain with them. It's like kind of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, the stages of grief. She's really angry, and she's really bargaining with them. And then there's this really peculiar part in the story where she hires herself out as a nursemaid to a wealthy family, and she does not reveal herself as the goddess Demeter, and she takes care of this little boy. And she decides that she wants to give the boy the gift of immortality. So she has to bank him in the fire like a log. She has to burn him in the fire to burn away his mortality so that he'll be immortal. But it's a long process. And one night while she's doing this, the mother walks in and is like horrified. And at that moment, Demeter reveals herself as the goddess. But I've always thought, I think that's such an interesting part of the story. And I've always thought that in a way, what she's doing there is she's trying to make sure that what happened to her daughter doesn't happen to this little boy. She's still trying in a way symbolically to kind of restore the old situation or to keep life from flowing forward. That this boy will never change. He'll never grow old. He'll never get sick. And it doesn't work. And it's at that point that she sort of really collapses into grief. And when she grieves, that's when the earth, becomes winter and nothing will grow. And that's when the gods say, okay, we'll let her come back, at least for a few months.
That's lovely and poignant that she has to collapse into grief. She does not have her daughter. She could not make this little boy immortal. All of the things that she was trying and striving to do have come to nothing. And she simply has to surrender to the awfulness, the sadness, and the reality of the losses.
Mm-hmm. And that's the person that you brought up, Joseph, where you were saying that he just was sort of fixated on trying to get this one person back.
Mm-hmm.
That he never grieved, right?
In a sense, it seemed that the fantasy of returning the love relationship interfered with the ability to grieve, because in order to grieve, one has to accept the fact that the love object is gone.
Mm-hmm.
We grieve someone who's passed away, for instance, because we know that they've passed away. Mm-hmm. And fantasizing that they're in the other room interferes with this reality that something is really gone and that you are really different and that you have to move forward. To me, the image that comes to mind is, I think all of us have at least one example of magnificent, naive love in our lives. And when that is cut down, as it inevitably is, there's a kind of tree stump that's left in our soul. But out of that tree stump, dozens or hundreds of small branches grow up from that main trunk. So I often feel that the capacity for many lesser loves comes forward or sprouts out of the severing of the one magnificent obsession. And in that way, we are more human, that we are related to the great venture of humanity, and that we may love any one person with less intensity than we might have when we were naive. But there's something much more delicate and well related to the community and placed in a context of loving that seems more human and, in a sense, perhaps more resilient.
I wonder if that's a good place to stop and make a transition to a dream.
Let's do it.
I think I would just like to say that we do have to let our hearts break.
Yeah.
And as you talked about with the ants, something will come. We have to let our hearts break. and let ourselves surrender and fall and descend, as did Persephone. And this is part of life, and see what happens.
Hi, this is Lisa from This Jungian Life podcast. Joseph, Deb, and I have been deeply moved by your responses to our work. Producing, editing, and distributing the podcast involves substantial expenses, and we need your help. Please stop by our website, thisjungianlife.com, and click on the heading Be Our Patron. You'll be redirected to our Patreon funding page. Patreon helps creators connect with people who believe in projects like ours. There, you can sign up with your credit card to support us for as little as $1 a month, and at higher levels of support, we'll provide special episodes, behind-the-scenes photos and stories, and a chance to join a select pool of listeners for dream interpretations. Thank you.
Here's our dream. We have a male dreamer, age 29, that also works as a therapist. And he writes, I am in a distant and unfamiliar town. I enter into a restaurant, but I don't have any money. I peek into the kitchen and casually ask one of the employees to hand me a bowl. I go over to the other side of the restaurant and begin to get some soup from the pot and eat it. Then one of the employees comes over to me. He's speaking Spanish and I can't understand him, but he's clearly asking me if I paid for it. I'm not really acknowledging him directly and jokingly say, No habla inglés. I finish the soup and casually walk out and know at this point that the employee will try to catch me. I hide in the forest and wait for him to pass by, and then begin to run in a different direction. I see the employee running around trying to search for me. Slowly, with the help of an unknown figure that's with me, I make it back to my car, but I'm constantly scanning to see where the employee is. I start driving off, but I notice almost immediately that my car is not at full power. It's revving high and not producing enough torque or speed, but continue to drive it anyway. The town is small, but feels kind of like a maze, and I struggle to find my way out of it. Eventually, the road ends and turns into a dirt trail that has tall grass further down, but there is a path where the grass had been pressed down from barn animals having stepped on it. Had it been higher grass, I don't think my car would have had enough power to plow through it. My car is really struggling at this point and barely moving forward. Then out of nowhere, a baby deer who appears frightened begins to run closer and closer to me, almost as if to get underneath me, sort of like a baby elephants do with their mother when they need protection. It no longer feels like I'm driving, but rather riding a bicycle. As the deer gets closer and closer, I keep pedaling and know that it's eventually going to get run over. The deer gets nicked and starts crying. I stop my bicycle and pick him up and begin to coddle and pet and kiss him. I really try to comfort him and apologize to him repeatedly. I can feel his little wet nose sniff me as I kiss him. The deer is so vulnerable and can't get enough of comforting him. It gives me a warm feeling to comfort and protect him. He gives us a little bit of context around the dream, and he tells us that he's experienced a major professional transition which challenged him and depleted him in many profound ways. He says now he feels pretty comfortable and happy with where he's at, and even though he feels okay, he's still struggling with self-esteem. He lets us know that initially in the dream he felt frantic and hypervigilant, attempting to evade the employee, but then felt very warm and tender after hugging and petting the baby deer.
I think it's interesting that the dreamer mentions that he's been depleted by this recent career challenge, because that really comes through in the dream, doesn't it? I mean, right in the second sentence, I don't have any money.
Mm-hmm.
So money is often sort of a metaphor for kind of life energy, and there just isn't very much life energy. And we see that later when the car just can't drive.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, there is some difficulty here. There's just not a lot of libido.
Although, interestingly enough, he seems to have plenty of energy to sneak in and get the soup. And he's very brave about kind of negotiating laughingly with the employee. And he's got a lot of energy to be sprinting around the forest, not unlike a deer, and getting to his car.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, there's something about libido and the idea of money. Money shows up, I think, differently in this dream that has more to do with something to exchange, that he seems very lively, but he has nothing to give the other person, which is a slightly different kind of internal impoverishment. But he himself is pretty sprightly.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say there's a defense going on here. That he, the attitude of the dream ego is he just goes to the other side of the restaurant and helps himself to the soup and begins to eat it. Then the employee is clearly asking him, hey, did you pay for that? And he's a little insulting almost of, hey, no hablā Ingles.
It's trickster energy, isn't it?
It's trickster, but it also is unfeeling.
But that's part of the trickster archetype. Like when I think the mercurial archetype also has a lot to do with humor. And we think of comedians kind of transcending really painful topics with this kind of hilarity, kind of skating over it in, I think, a very trickster way.
I think I don't want to kind of honor the theft as trickster energy. It doesn't feel so mythic to me. It feels like he's pulling a fast one and he knows it and he doesn't care.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking, here's the situation. I'm in a distant and unfamiliar town. So he's in new psychic territory, we might say. And I'm in a restaurant. So he's not cooking at home. He's not feeding himself. A restaurant is where you have to go and pay for food that somebody else has made. So he's not feeding himself. He's kind of stealing, or, I'll accept your idea here of trickstering his way into getting a free meal.
Well, there is a very interesting question for me here, which is what do we make of this employee? This employee who's kind of enforcing the rule that you need to pay, that he's running from. What is he? I mean, one of you said a minute ago about a defense. What is he running from here? Who is trying to call him to account?
To me, it seems like that there's something in the psyche that's saying you have to give something.
Mm-hmm.
You don't just get to take. And there is something in the spirit of the psyche that is holding him to have to interact with the employee or the generator of the soup. And of course, we don't know this person, but I could imagine, perhaps somebody's in a relationship and they enjoy what the partner gives and the esteem and maybe the generosity, or maybe they come over for dinner a lot, all these kinds of things. And maybe the guy just isn't able or doesn't feel that there's any emotional generosity, that they're not able to give back in equal measure in the commerce of the relationship. And something in the psyche demands that they open up and give something.
And so you're kind of pointing me toward the idea that this employee, who is presumably lower down on the hierarchy, the social hierarchy.
Mm-hmm, right.
He's posing, and he says in his associations that he thinks he's a card-carrying member of the imposter syndrome club. So he's an imposter in a sense that he's going in as a customer.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then someone lower down in the hierarchy is holding him to account, and he can kind of just blow that off.
Mm-hmm.
But it's some part of the psyche that is Spanish speaking, maybe an immigrant or probably an immigrant, and you can just blow those people off. and run around in the woods.
There's one way that dreams can kind of be constructed, which if we understand that the dream essentially comes from the self, one thing that a dream can do is show you what the dream ego looks like from the perspective of the self.
Yes.
And this might be one of those dreams. That's kind of the way we're tending with it, where the self is saying, like, look, you're sneaking around out there, going about stealing things and blowing off, the hardworking immigrant.
Right, that you're taking what you need, but you're not opening up and giving back. That there's not a full circle.
Either monetarily or relationally.
Well, I'm thinking more relationally
me
than
too,
monetarily.
with the employee, that he doesn't care. He just sort of jokes with him and says, I don't speak, no habla inglés. I don't speak
But
Spanish.
here's the thing is that, I'm really seeing this intrapsychically. So, the good news is he has the employee part. That employee is a part of his psyche,
Right.
So these are probably my personal associations, but, this real hardworking immigrant who's, going to sort of work all day and kind of do the right thing. That's part of him. And, but what the self is telling him maybe with this dream is, hey, dream ego, you are not tending to this part of yourself fairly. You are shortchanging yourself.
Mm-hmm. That's a great use of shortchanging yourself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I want to advance that with the association that this fellow has struggled a little bit with self-esteem. And, and what are the defenses that people might bring forward when they're showing up in a situation where they have low self-esteem? So again, maybe imagining this fellow on a date. And does the trickster offer a certain kind of bravado, a kind of inflation in the personality to mask the truth, which is, I really don't have anything to give here, or don't feel that I do. Right. And yet, maybe I'll drink in your positive regard for me, or drink in this feeling that you're giving me that I'm a good, viable mate. But internally, I feel like I've got to run out the back door so I don't get caught with the reality that I don't really have much to give.
Right. And in a way, he's kind of running from himself, right?
Yes.
The reality of himself.
Right. That when we talk about the idea of the broken heart, that if he were to walk in with somebody whose heart was broken, he might say, I'm broken and I'm empty and I'm hungry and I'm in a state of needing and I'm hoping you could be generous to me. And I wonder how the employee or how the psyche might respond to that versus coming in this tricky way, probably because he doesn't believe that if he came in with his brokenness, that anyone would respond.
Yeah, so it's this kind of inflation, that's sort of defending against maybe ordinariness or depletion.
Well, the feeling of poverty, of some kind of psycho-spiritual poverty.
And that he will not be given to. He can't be self-disclosing and vulnerable and humble. Instead, with all this bravado, he just has to take it.
Right, and then jump out the door.
And then run away.
And the psyche says, no way, we're not going to have this.
And he goes from being in the distant and unfamiliar town, I hide in the forest. So forests are classic images of the unknown, unconscious parts of ourselves. All kinds of things in fairy tales happen in the forest. So he's gone deeper into the unconscious than he was at the beginning.
And then he has this amazing encounter. What I'm imagining is the baby deer, the fawn, is him.
Oh, absolutely.
Because I have to tell you, I live out in the country in North Carolina. When you see an unattended fawn, that fawn's not going to last. It's just not going to happen. And that happens during hunting season because deers are getting shot. They're not supposed to be hunting the does, but often they will. And you'll see these abandoned fawns out in the fields.
Well, so here the in-between part, I think, is important. So he manages to evade the employee. He manages to evade this, his inner, immigrant or something, and gets back to his car. But the car is just not able to do it.
But the transmission is not working properly.
Mm-hmm.
So the engine revs, but the power of the engine isn't translated through the transmission into the drive, into the wheels.
And so there's just not a lot of power. And that would be like sort of our typical way of moving through the world is just not working anymore. It just doesn't have any power behind it. And in fact, the road ends. So now we're really in new territory. There's not even a road there. And the car is really struggling and barely moving forward.
I want to just jump in here for a sec because I'm thinking of cars as extensions, enlargements of our ego. They, unlike a train or a bus or something that has a prescribed route and is for everybody, the car goes where the driver wants it to go. So he seems to vault into an even more sort of ego-oriented position.
Right, but it's not working.
And
that's kind of
working.
the good news. And then we can kind of do our when-then thing. So my car is really struggling at this point and barely moving forward. Then out of nowhere, a baby deer appears. So it's like when my strategy, my egoic strategy for moving through the world fails, then I have the encounter with the baby deer.
With a vulnerable, young part of his instinctual nature, young and vulnerable.
It's again this kind of baby at the top of the stairs thing.
Yes.
Yeah, referencing a dream that we speak about in another podcast.
The other thing the fantasy that I have is that the employee, is the agent of a larger force in the psyche.
Mm-hmm.
And in one sense, I feel like the employee chases him into the forest. That there's this feeling like he's being progressively corralled deeper into the unconscious and deeper towards this image of his deeply vulnerable self that is capable of crying out for help. So the little wet nose sniffs, kisses, and there is nuzzling. So there's a way in which, fawns need a lot of things. And like most animals in need, their needs are uncompromised by any kind of neurotic stuff. Like animals need what they need and they make their needs known. Fawns bleat or they nurse or, they struggle for life. So for him to be brought in touch with his inner fawn is to really surrender this whole trickstery stuff in the beginning of the dream.
Right. The inflation's gone.
Yes.
And we also know the inflation's gone because the car turns into a bicycle.
Yeah. Just like a creature of the forest, you're working on the power of your legs.
Yeah.
And I have this fantasy that if he were to return to the restaurant like a fawn, that would be a very different encounter with the bounty of the restaurant.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're seeing is sort of the dropping of neurotic defenses and collapsing into a more authentic place, I think. Yeah. I think that's what this
And he has
shows.
to stop in order to get to that place of hustling and rustling his way through the restaurant, hide in the forest, get in the car, then jump on a bicycle. He has to stop all this frantic feeling activity, revving up his car and so. And when he stops, he feels the love for the deer. He says, "I try to comfort him." He kisses him, gives me a warm feeling to comfort and protect him. He has a number of sentences here. He can connect with his own fawn, his own inner fawn, when he stops trying to drive and bike and manipulate his way through life.
Yeah.
And also the fellow says that he's working as a therapist. What I can imagine is that even though there may be this frantic quality, in the first part of the dream, but when he's able to connect to what's young and wounded and abandoned in other people, as well as himself, it evokes this very motherly feeling inside of him and this great capacity to be protective and affectionate and comforting. So I'm imagining that it's been really healing for him to work as a therapist, and to have a safe context where he can encounter people's woundedness and respond in a loving way that he hopefully doesn't flee from.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like the streamer probably has some ways to go yet, because he knows that the deer is going to get run over, but he doesn't stop until the deer gets nicked and starts crying. And then I also did notice that the language is all about how good it makes him feel to comfort the deer. So there's still the kind of center of gravity is still really with the ego.
And he uses also the image of the mother elephant and the baby elephant. And then he's working as a therapist. So, we learn a lot from our clients, and we find those places in ourselves that clients tell us about in themselves. But we are in the position of authority. It's a safer and more observational spot.
But I would fantasize for this fellow that to stay with that image, to really metabolize that image of himself holding and cuddling the deer, that to me, that's the magic
Yes.
gift in this dream. And as we do with many of our clients, we encourage people to draw a picture of that and to find it precious, to write about it, write poems about it, journal extensively, to research the life of deers, to research what happens to fawns that are alone in the woods, and to do whatever he can to make that moment real over and over again, so that the impact of the gift of the fawn can change him and ripen him in this direction that the psyche is being wise about. And then something new will happen after that. There's another step, of course. But it's certainly a really better part of him comes forward when he encounters the deer. And you're right, the gateway, I think, is just this little tinge of guilt, which he's not able to feel in the first part of the dream.
That's right. He doesn't feel
like
guilt.
He can't imagine that he's hurt anybody by stealing the soup. So then he feels kind of privileged to just play the game of escaping. But when he clearly sees that he's nicked this innocent being, he stops dead in his tracks.
Something happens.
Yeah, there's a moral moment in that part of the dream that calls him to do something.
He is aware of the impact his uncaring ride on the bicycle has had. And he's not aware of his impact on the employee in the restaurant at the outset of the dream. So there's a growth in empathy here. Of, I have wronged and committed a wrong, which he doesn't feel in the restaurant, and he does feel with the deer, and he wants to make a repair.
Yeah, there's it's a real outpicturing of a kind of psychological development process, I think.
And when I think of the trickster archetype, when it is in somebody's personality, that really for a person like that to face that they have hurt someone is very grounding. Wow, this wasn't all fun and games. I really nicked you or hurt your feelings or broke your heart.
Or did some violence to some vulnerable part of myself.
And that it matters.
Yes, it does matter. I'm thinking in the context of what we talked about before of letting our hearts break. In a way, he lets his heart break for this helpless baby, motherless deer. And there's empathy all of a sudden, compassion and tenderness. And that has come in from his feeling it in his heart. And he was hard-hearted at the beginning of the dream.
Yes, it was more kind of a game, or appeared to be in that part of the dream. So again, I think that the dream is hopeful. I think that there's a medicine in the dream. I think that his psyche is generous. And it's good to know that there are these warm, nuzzling fawns
in the forest
roaming around inside of him that are willing to meet him and even chase him down. I mean, the fawn's kind of running alongside him.
Just like the employee was chasing him before.
Yes.
And really insisting in a way on an encounter. with
Yes.
him. That does happen in the dream.
Yes.
I think about the well-known first verse from a Leonard Cohen song, "There's a crack in everything." That's where the light gets in. Forget your perfect offering. Ring the bells, it still can ring. That he comes down into something that cracks open and the light does come in.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.